20 million years ago, the Earth cracked open beneath the North Atlantic. Magma surged upward through the wound, building mountains in darkness, stone piling upon stone beneath thousands of feet of cold ocean water. For millennia, these underwater peaks grew in silence, until finally, in an explosion of steam that no human eye witnessed, they broke the surface. Iceland was born in that moment, a child of fire meeting ice, and for millions of years after, it sat empty. One of the last places on Earth, untouched by human footsteps. Black volcanic beaches pounded endlessly by Arctic storms, glaciers carving deep fjords into rock that had never known warmth. The first humans to glimpse these shores were not warriors or explorers seeking glory. They were Irish monks called Papa, arriving around 795 after Christ in tiny leather boats called curraghs, vessels that seem impossibly fragile for crossing the North Atlantic's treacherous waters. These hermits came seeking something most of us can barely imagine: ultimate isolation for prayer. They built stone cells on cliff tops where the wind never stopped howling, surviving on seabirds and angelica root, spending months in meditation during the endless polar nights when the sun abandoned them entirely. But here is what the records do not tell us. How many monks actually made the journey? The sagas mention them only in passing, ghost-like figures already fading into legend by the time Iceland's true settlers arrived. Did they leave behind more than stone cells? And when Viking sails appeared on the horizon around 870, the monks vanished. Some say they sailed west into the unknown rather than share their sanctuary. West toward what? Greenland had not yet been discovered. Where did these holy men go? And what did they know about the waters beyond Iceland that we have forgotten? Ingólfur Arnason stood at his ship's prow in 874. After Christ, gripping the carved wooden pillars from his high seat, his chief's throne from Norway, the symbol of his authority and lineage. Following ancient tradition, he hurled them into the waves, vowing to the gods to settle wherever they washed them ashore. For 3 years his slaves searched the coastline, trudging through black sand and volcanic rock, while Ingólfur waited, until they found the pillars in a bay filled with steam from hot springs. He named it Reykjavik Smoky Bay, and claimed the land as his own. Within 60 years, 60,000 Vikings had followed Ingólfur's path, fleeing King Harald Fairhair's tyranny in Norway. They brought everything needed to transplant civilization across 800 miles of ocean: cattle, sheep, horses, and most importantly, their families and dreams of freedom. But here is what puzzles historians. How did 60,000 people coordinate this migration without modern communication? What network of planning and information existed that we can barely trace in the archaeological record? The scale suggests something more organized than random refugees fleeing a king. The land fought back against these invaders with a violence that nearly broke them. The first winter killed most livestock settlers discovered too late that Icelandic grass, sparse and tough, could not sustain Norwegian cattle bred for richer pastures. Volcanic soil, while eventually fertile, needed generations to cultivate. Trees that existed were quickly cut for homes and ships, leaving a barren landscape that could not regenerate. Families that had been prosperous farmers in Norway faced starvation on this island at the edge of the world. Yet these Vikings adapted with stunning ingenuity that still shapes Iceland today. They built houses from turf and stone that could withstand hurricane winds. Structures so low and earth-covered they seemed to grow from the landscape itself. They learned to preserve food in whey and salt, transforming summer's abundance into winter. Survival. They learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations with an accuracy that bordered on prophecy, and to navigate using crystals likely Iceland's spar, a form of calcite that could locate the sun's position through fog and clouds. But here is what the sagas rarely explain. How did they discover these navigation crystals worked? What experiments occurred? What knowledge did they inherit from earlier seafarers that has been lost to us? The isolation that preserved Iceland from invasion also created a genetic bottleneck. Those 60,000 settlers became the ancestors of everyone who would ever call themselves Icelandic. Modern genetic studies reveal fascinating patterns. Iceland's population today can trace its lineage with precision unknown anywhere else on Earth. Most Icelanders are descended from a few dozen founding families. But the genetic analysis reveals something unexpected. A significant percentage of maternal lineages trace not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles, which raises uncomfortable questions the sagas prefer not to address. How many of the wives brought by Viking settlers came willingly? The landscape itself became a character in Iceland's story, shaping the psychology of everyone who lived there. Imagine being a child in 900 after Christ, growing up in a place where the ground beneath your feet could literally open and swallow your farm, where winters brought darkness so complete you could not see your hand before your face for months, where glaciers groaned and cracked like living things, where auroras danced across the sky in colors that seemed to come from another world entirely. The sagas are filled with ghosts, with hidden people, with magic seeping through the boundaries of reality. Were these merely stories? Or does extreme isolation in a hostile landscape actually change how the human mind perceives the world? The settlers brought their gods with them, Thor, Odin, Freya, but something changed in the transplanting. Iceland's version of Norse mythology developed its own character, darker and stranger than the tales told in Norway or Sweden. More ghosts, more ambiguity, more unfinished business between the living and dead. The boundary between worlds seemed thinner here, at the edge of the known world where ice met fire. By 900 after Christ, Iceland had transformed from a geological curiosity into a functioning society. Farmsteads dotted the coastlines, ships came and went, trading Icelandic goods for European luxuries. Children were born who had never known Norway, who thought of Iceland not as exile but as home. The settlement era was ending. What came next would be even more improbable. The creation of Europe's first true democracy, built not in a safe river valley but on a volcanic island where the earth itself refused to stay still. But that is a story for shadows yet to come. 930. After Christ marked humanity's most unlikely experiment in democracy. While Europe descended into feudalism, kings consolidating power, peasants becoming serfs bound to land they would never own. Iceland's scattered farmers created something that should not have been possible. The Althing, a parliament where free men gathered each summer at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the North American and European continental plates slowly tear apart at a rate of 2 centimeters per year. Stand in that valley and you are literally standing between two continents, the earth groaning beneath your feet as forces beyond human comprehension pull the world apart. No kings ruled here. Instead, 39 chieftains called Gothar shared power in a system so complex it seems designed to prevent anyone from accumulating absolute authority. Any free man could choose which chieftain to follow and could switch allegiance if dissatisfied. The chieftains themselves had no military force to compel obedience, no castles, no standing armies. Their power rested entirely on reputation and the willingness of free men to support them. When disputes arose, they were settled through law and arbitration, not royal decree. But here is what the chronicles barely acknowledge. How did this system actually function across an island with no roads, where farms might be days of difficult travel apart? The Althing met for only 2 weeks each summer. The rest of the year, chieftains dispersed to their scattered farmsteads. What held this society together in the silence of winter? What networks of communication and trust existed that we can only glimpse in fragments? The Commonwealth period spawned the Saga Age, when Icelanders became Europe's greatest storytellers. During the endless winter nights of the 11 and 1200s, families gathered in their turf houses' main halls. Smoke from the central fire pit curled up through roof holes. The smell of whale oil lamps mixed with the scent of dried fish hanging from rafters. And someone, perhaps an old woman who had memorized thousands of lines, perhaps a travelling poet, would recite tales that lasted for hours. Egil Skallagrimsson, the poet-warrior who composed verses while killing his enemies, who was so ugly people turned away but so brilliant his poetry survived 1,000 years. Guthrun Osviferfersdottir, who married 4 times and outlived them all, the most complex female character in medieval literature, driven by love and revenge in equal measure. These were not just entertainment. The sagas were law libraries, containing precedents for every conceivable dispute. They were history lessons, connecting every family to the settlement generation. They were psychological manuals for surviving in isolation, teaching through story what could not be taught through direct instruction. Every farmstead memorized genealogies going back to the settlement, creating an oral encyclopedia of Icelandic society so detailed that modern Icelanders can still trace their ancestry with precision no other nation can match. But here is what troubles the careful reader. The sagas were written down in the 12 and 1300s, centuries after the events they describe. How much did they preserve accurately? How much did they create? When a saga describes conversations between people who died 200 years before the saga was written, whose words are we really hearing? The boundary between history and fiction blurs in ways that medieval Icelanders might not have recognized as a problem. Women held extraordinary power in this remote democracy, power that would have been unthinkable in the rest of medieval Europe. Author the Deep-Minded arrived in 895, after Christ, as a widow with 20 free men and numerous slaves under her command. She claimed vast lands in western Iceland, freed her slaves and gave them farmsteads of their own, and built churches, all while refusing marriage proposals to maintain her independence. The law codes gave women divorce rights that would not exist in most of Europe for another 1,000 years. They could own property outright, run entire households during their husbands' Viking expeditions that might last years, and even serve as Gothar in rare cases. What created this unusual equality? Some scholars suggest the harsh environment demanded its survival required every capable person to exercise authority. Others point to Iceland's isolation from European feudal models. But the sagas themselves suggest something deeper, a fundamental belief that capability, not gender, determined authority. When Aud the Deep-Minded made decisions, no one questioned her right to do so. She had proven herself through survival and wisdom. That was enough. But isolation could not protect paradise forever. In the year 1000, the Althing faced its greatest crisis, civil war between Christians and pagans. Christian Icelanders had ties to Norway and Europe, where baptism was increasingly mandatory for trade. Pagan Icelanders clung to the old gods who had carried their ancestors across the sea. The island balanced on the edge of religious warfare that would have destroyed the Commonwealth before it reached a century old. The law speaker, Thorgeir Ljósvetningagoði, a pagan himself, retreated under his cloak for a day and night at Thingvellir, while both sides waited. What thoughts moved through his mind during those hours? He emerged with a solution that seems almost impossibly pragmatic for the medieval period. Iceland would officially convert to Christianity to maintain trade with Christian Europe, but pagan practice could continue privately. Worship Thor in your home if you wish, but baptize your children in church. This compromise saved Iceland from religious warfare, but it opened the door to foreign influence that would eventually destroy the Commonwealth. The medieval warm period from 900 to 1300, after Christ blessed Iceland with temperatures that seem impossible now. Grain grew in fields now buried under glaciers. Barley ripened in valleys that have not seen successful harvests in 700 years. The population reached 80,000 more than would live there again until the 20th century. Icelanders traded walrus ivory and falcon hawks to European courts, bringing back wealth and knowledge that transformed their isolated society. Cathedrals were built. Books were written. Iceland's golden age seemed eternal. But here is what the climate records reveal. The medieval warm period was already ending by 1200. Temperatures began dropping, growing seasons shortened. The North Atlantic became more treacherous. And as the physical climate cooled, Iceland's political climate heated toward catastrophe. Blood feuds between powerful families spiraled out of control. The system of 39 equal chieftains collapsed as strong families absorbed weaker ones. The Gothar, who had once been mediators, became warlords. The age of the Sturlungs, named after the most violent family, saw armies of hundreds fighting pitched battles on an island that had never known war. Churches were burned with people inside. Entire farmsteads were slaughtered. In 1244, at the Battle of Haugsness, More Icelanders died in a single day than in the previous 100 years combined. The sagas that described this period are notably different in tone from earlier ones, grimmer, more bitter, as if the writers could not quite believe what their society had become. Exhausted by civil war, facing cooling temperatures and failing harvests, the Althing made a decision that must have seemed inevitable by 1262. They surrendered independence to the Norwegian crown. The assembly that had governed itself for over 3 centuries voted to accept a foreign king. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to restore order. But it began 7 centuries of foreign rule that would nearly destroy everything that made Iceland unique. The last meeting of the Free Althing must have been a strange affair. Did they know what they were giving away? Did they understand that this decision would echo through centuries? Or did they simply believe they had no choice, that survival demanded submission? The age of independence was over. The age of darkness was beginning. 1300, after Christ brought the Little Ice Age crashing down on Iceland like a giant's fist. Glaciers that had been slowly retreating suddenly reversed, advancing year by year, swallowing entire valleys that had been farmed for 4 centuries. Pack ice from Greenland surrounded the island for months each year, cutting trade routes that had kept Iceland connected to Europe. Ships that tried to reach Iceland in winter simply vanished, claimed by ice floes and storms that seemed to come from nowhere. The Black Death arrived in 1402 on a ship that drifted into an Icelandic harbour with its entire crew dead. Imagine being the farmers who found it a ghost ship with bodies in the rigging, cargo still lashed in the hold, and something invisible and deadly waiting in the darkness below deck. Half of Iceland's population died within 2 years. Farms abandoned during the plague were never resettled. Their ruins still dot the landscape today, stone foundations slowly sinking into the earth, becoming indistinguishable from the volcanic rock around them. Walk across Iceland's interior and you will find these ghosts, a pile of stones that was once someone's home, someone's dream, now marked only by the grass growing slightly greener where the turf walls decomposed. But here is what the parish records hint at without quite saying. Some farms were abandoned before anyone died. Families fled ahead of the plague, heading into the interior or to remote valleys, trying to outrun death itself. Did they survive? There are stories, whispered in later centuries, of wild families living in caves, descendants of plague refugees who never returned to civilization. Folklore? Perhaps. But Iceland's interior is vast and hostile enough to hide almost anything. Norwegian rule passed to Denmark in 1380 through royal marriage, a political arrangement made in distant courts that meant nothing to Icelandic farmers until they discovered what Danish rule actually meant. The Danish crown imposed a trade monopoly, decreeing that only Danish merchants could trade with Iceland. Not Norwegian, not English, not even other Icelanders, only Denmark. These merchants charged outrageous prices, a pound of flour for a whole sheep, a knife for a cow, while paying almost nothing for Icelandic fish and wool. When Mount Hekla erupted in 1510, spewing ash that darkened the sky for weeks and destroyed what little cropland remained, Danish traders refused to bring extra supplies. Thousands starved while warehouses in Denmark sat full of grain that could have saved them. Europeans called Hekla the gateway to hell, claiming they could hear the screams of the damned in its eruptions. Scholars in universities debated whether Hekla was the actual location of purgatory. But here is what those scholars never considered. What do you call home when everyone else calls it hell? How does it shape you, living under a mountain that the rest of the world believes leads directly to damnation? The Laki volcanic fissure tore open the earth in 1783, creating a catastrophe that nearly ended Icelandic civilization entirely. For 8 months, lava fountains shot 500 feet high, along a 16-mile crack that had not existed before. The volume of lava that emerged could have buried all of Manhattan under 300 feet of molten rock. But the lava was not the worst of it. Poisonous gases, fluorine compounds that are invisible and odorless, drifted across the entire island. 75% of livestock died within weeks, their bones dissolving from fluorine poisoning. Sheep staggered and fell, their legs giving out as fluorine ate their bones from the inside. Cattle went blind, horses suffocated on ash. The haze famine that followed killed 10,000 people, a quarter of the entire population. Not quickly, but slowly, over years of starvation. The few written records from this period make for difficult reading. Families drawing lots to decide who would eat, parents dying quietly in the night so their children could have their portion. Entire districts reduced to a handful of survivors. The youngest and oldest died first, then the weak, then everyone who could not endure starvation's slow, grinding torture. Jon Steingrimsson, a priest in the town of Kirkjubearklostur, became legendary for his fire sermon. As lava approached his wooden church, he gathered his congregation, perhaps 50 people, everyone who remained alive in the district, and preached while the ground shook and the air filled with ash. His words were recorded, and they are not what you might expect. He did not promise salvation or beg for mercy. He told his congregation that they had survived worse, that they would survive this, that Iceland had always survived. As he spoke, the lava flow miraculously stopped at the church boundary. The cooled lava field remains visible today, stopping as cleanly as if an invisible wall had held it back. But here is what the church records do not explain. Why did the lava stop? Geologists suggest the flow simply ran out of momentum at that precise location. Others point to underground water channels that cooled it, but survivors called it a miracle, and perhaps they needed to believe in miracles to endure what came after. Danish officials seriously discussed evacuating the entire surviving population to Denmark. Plans were drawn up, ships were considered. Iceland would become an abandoned island, a failed experiment in human habitation, its population absorbed into Denmark like so many other conquered peoples. But Icelanders refused to abandon their homeland. They refused with a stubbornness that seems almost incomprehensible. What was there to stay for? Poisoned soil, dead livestock, a climate growing colder every year. Yet they stayed. They ate seaweed, every variety they could identify as non-poisonous. They ate lichens scraped from rocks. They ate leather boots, saddles, anything that could be boiled soft enough to chew. One farmer's journal, preserved in the National Museum in Reykjavik, records his family surviving an entire winter on angelica roots and a single cow that they bled weekly for nutrition without killing it. They needed that cow alive for spring ploughing. The entries grow shorter and more sparse as winter progresses, the handwriting shakier, until a final entry in March. The cow is still alive. So are we. The Icelandic horse, brought by Vikings and isolated for 900 years with no crossbreeding, evolved unique traits that saved countless lives during these centuries. These horses could survive on minimal food, that would kill other breeds. They could navigate through blizzards that left humans completely blind, finding their way home through some sense we still do not fully understand. They developed a special gait called tolt, a running walk that riders could endure for hours without the jarring trot of other horses. When a farmer became lost in a snowstorm, often his only chance of survival was to give the horse its head and trust it to find home. Through these dark centuries, Icelanders preserved what Denmark tried to destroy: their language and stories. Danish became mandatory for official business, for any interaction with the colonial administration. But Icelandic remained pure at home, the closest living language to Old Norse, barely changed from what the Vikings spoke. Mothers taught children the sagas in secret, whispering the old stories while Danish officials slept. Farmers hid medieval manuscripts in turf house walls, wrapped in leather to protect them from moisture. When Danish authorities demanded these manuscripts be sent to Copenhagen for preservation, many simply disappeared, hidden in locations that died with their guardians. When Denmark finally allowed a printing press in 1772, 4 centuries after Gutenberg, the first book printed was the Bible in Icelandic, not in Danish, as the colonial authorities wanted, but in the language that had survived volcanic fire and ice age cold. That Bible ensured the language's survival. A people might lose their land, their wealth, their independence, but as long as they kept their words, kept their stories, something essential remained alive. But here is what those stories never quite acknowledge. What does survival cost? What pieces of yourself do you lose when starvation becomes normal? When watching your children die becomes expected? when the question is not whether you will suffer but only how much. The sagas speak of heroes and glory. The records from the Little Ice Age speak only of endurance, year after year, century after century, holding on with bloody fingernails to a land that seemed determined to kill everyone who loved it. John Sigurðsson, a scholar living in Copenhagen, ignited Iceland's independence movement in the 1840s without ever raising a weapon. He never led an army, never gave a rousing battlefield speech, never shed blood for his cause. Instead, he weaponized history itself. Working in Danish archives that most Icelanders could never access, he discovered and published medieval documents, proving that Denmark had illegally absorbed Iceland. The original agreement from 1262 had made Iceland a subject of the Norwegian king personally, not of Norway as a state. When Norway passed to Denmark through royal marriage, that agreement should have been void. Iceland, Jon argued with lawyers' precision and scholars' evidence, had been stolen through a legal technicality that no one had questioned for 5 centuries. The 1874 millennium celebration of settlement became a massive nationalist rally that even Denmark could not ignore. 40,000 Icelanders, half the entire population, gathered at Thingvellir, that ancient rift valley where the first Althing had met. They came on horseback, in wagons, on foot, travelling for days across roadless terrain. Even the Danish king attended, perhaps not realizing he was witnessing his own authority being symbolically rejected. Songs were sung in Icelandic, poems recited, the sagas read aloud, and everyone understood the message. We are still here. We remember who we were. We will be that again. But here is what the official commemorations never mention. Danish authorities had informants throughout the crowd, recording who spoke most passionately, who seemed to be organizing, who might be dangerous. Those names went into files in Copenhagen. Some of those men found their businesses mysteriously failing afterward, their loans called in, their permits denied. Independence would not be won without cost, even when the weapons were only words. World War I changed everything in ways no one anticipated. While Denmark remained neutral, Iceland discovered it could trade fish with both sides of the conflict. British gold, German silver. For the first time in centuries, wealth flowed into Iceland rather than being extracted. Farmers who had scraped by for generations suddenly had money. The population, which had been slowly declining, began to grow again. Young people who would have emigrated to America stayed home instead. The war that killed millions created Iceland's first taste of prosperity. The 1918 Sovereignty Act made Iceland independent in all but name, sharing only a king with Denmark while controlling its own internal affairs. But then Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, and Iceland stood truly alone. The Danish king was a prisoner. The Danish government was dissolved, and Iceland, suddenly, had no legal connection to anyone. British forces invaded Iceland. That same year invaded is the right word, though no shots were fired. They simply arrived with overwhelming force and occupied the country, explaining apologetically that they could not allow Germany to take control of Iceland's strategic position. Then American forces arrived in 1941, replacing the British, 30,000 soldiers on an island with a population of only 120,000. The Americans paid high wages, built airports and roads, introduced jazz and chewing gum, and a glimpse of a world most Icelanders had only read about. And most importantly, they recognized Iceland as separate from Denmark, negotiating directly with Icelandic authorities as if Iceland were already independent. On June 17, 1944, while Nazi forces still occupied Denmark, 35,000 Icelanders gathered at Thingvellir in driving rain to declare complete independence. They chose that date to honor John Sigurðsson's birthday, the scholar who had died in 1879 without seeing his dream realized. The new republic's first president was Svein Björnsson, who as a young man had hidden medieval manuscripts from Danish confiscation, wrapping them in oilcloth and burying them in secret locations. Now he stood in the rain at Thingvellir, where democracy had been born 1,000 years before, and declared it reborn. But here is what makes that moment strange. Denmark was occupied. They could not protest even if they wanted to. Some Danes felt betrayed. Iceland declaring independence while Denmark suffered under Nazi rule seemed like abandonment. Others understood. The Icelandic declaration carefully noted that this was not a rejection of Denmark but an acknowledgement of reality. Still, questions linger in the historical record. Would Iceland have declared independence if Denmark had been free to object? Or did they wait, consciously or not, for the moment when Denmark could not say no? The Cod Wars from 1958 to 1976 proved that tiny Iceland could defeat superpowers through sheer stubborn refusal to back down. When Britain refused to recognize Iceland's expanded fishing zones, first to 12 miles, then 50, then 200 Icelandic Coast Guard vessels with crews of 30 faced off against the Royal Navy. They developed special devices called trawl wire cutters, designed to slice through the steel cables of British fishing nets. British trawlers would work for days, then find their nets suddenly dropping away, thousands of pounds of fish and equipment lost in an instant. When Britain sent warships to protect their trawlers, Iceland threatened to close the NATO base at Keflavik, crucial for monitoring Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic. During the Cold War, that base was worth more than all the fish in Iceland's waters. Britain backed down, not once but 3 times, in 3 separate Cod Wars spanning nearly 20 years. Fish, Iceland's silver of the sea, transformed the nation from Europe's poorest to one of its richest within a generation. The 2008 financial crisis hit Iceland harder than any volcanic eruption. The 3 major banks collapsed in a single week. The currency lost half its value overnight. Icelanders who had mortgages in foreign currencies, encouraged by those same banks, woke up to find their debts had doubled. The stock market lost 90% of its value. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed Iceland might actually cease to exist as an independent nation, forced to beg for bailouts that would come with strings attached. Sovereignty traded for survival once again. But then, something unexpected happened. Thousands of Icelanders surrounded Parliament in Reykjavik, banging pots and pans in what became known as the kitchenware revolution, not with guns or bombs, but with the tools of their kitchens, making noise that could not be ignored. They forced the government to resign. They demanded accountability, and unlike in 2008 financial crises elsewhere, Iceland actually jailed the bankers responsible. CEOs went to prison. The financial system was rebuilt from scratch. But here is what remains mysterious about Iceland's recovery. It worked. Most economists predicted decades of poverty. Instead, Iceland recovered faster than almost any other nation hit by the crisis. How? They crowdsourced a new constitution, letting ordinary citizens contribute ideas online. They rebuilt their economy on sustainable foundations. Fishing managed for long-term survival, renewable energy, and tourism. But was it the policies that saved them, or something deeper, that same stubborn refusal to give up that had carried them through volcanic eruptions and ice age cold? Today, Iceland runs entirely on renewable energy, geothermal and hydroelectric power, born from the same volcanic forces that once brought death. The volcanoes that nearly destroyed Iceland now heat its homes and power its cities. The isolation that nearly destroyed them now protects their language, with committees creating new Icelandic words rather than adopting foreign terms. A smartphone becomes a smart seamer. A computer is a tolva combining the words for number and profit, a machine that calculates the future. 370,000 people speak Icelandic today, more than ever in history. The population has never been larger. Life expectancy is among the world's highest. And yet something haunts the edge of Iceland's success story. Climate change is warming the Arctic faster than anywhere else on Earth. The glaciers that have shaped Iceland for millions of years are melting, revealing landscapes that have not seen sunlight since the last ice age. What will they reveal? What has been hidden beneath the ice? Iceland was born from fire and ice, and for 1100 years those forces nearly destroyed it again and again. The monks who fled west into the unknown, the sagas that blur history and myth, the families who ate leather to survive, the banker who went to prison while bankers elsewhere went free. Iceland's story has always been about survival against impossible odds, about refusing to accept that some places are simply too harsh for human life. But here is what we still do not know. What comes next? Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, where continents are still being born, where the earth is still tearing itself apart. Another Lucky could open tomorrow. Another financial crisis could strike. The climate that is warming now could cool again. Iceland has survived everything history has thrown at it, but that is no guarantee. Nothing in Iceland's past promises anything about its future except this. Whatever comes, Icelanders will face it the way they always have, with stubborn endurance, practical innovation, and stories that refuse to let the darkness win completely. The saga continues. The ending has not been written yet,